So, not a lot of time, want to be efficient with our content. And I want to focus, as we did in the class way back when, on your thematic, like your understanding of the themes of history, understanding how all that connects thematically. I don't really care if you know a specific fact or date or whatever. The AP test also doesn't really care anymore if you know a specific fact or date or anything. Those are just not as important anymore. The most important thing is if you have some basic knowledge of those kinds of stuff, like the Sugar Act or I don't know, the Zimmerman Note or stuff like that. You should have some basic knowledge of all this stuff, but you can do that yourself. You can easily find any set of cheat sheets or whatever to review like the factual part. I want to focus on what happened, why they happened, and make sure you really understand the sorts of questions that are coming out in the AP test. So Nathan, Cody, you guys are taking the AP test this year? Okay. When is it? 4th, 5th, something?
I think it's the 6th.
It's next Friday.
Okay, next Friday. Okay, great. How are you guys feeling?
I think I'm ready.
I kind of accidentally signed up for it. So I haven't taken the class yet because I'm a freshman.
Okay, that's fine. That's like kudos to you. You can do this. I've self-studied for many AP tests. I mean, it's a bit difficult when you're a freshman, but you can do this. Important things for this is let's start with some of the earlier content because that's like I think some of the most easily forgotten stuff. And I want to make sure you guys understand how to process that sort of information. So I'm just going to kind of give you questions that are not too dissimilar to the sort of conceptual stuff you'll see on the AP test, and I want you to answer them and we can talk about how you can improve them. Because the biggest thing you can lose points on is one is having like kind of subpar analysis for your response questions, like, you know, not really having anything interesting to say when you're stitching together the documents in the DBQ or in the full FRQ. Like if you're just like repeating factual information, you'll probably get a bad score on that. So make sure you have some like interesting things to say kind of in advance of the test about like most major period in history. You should know some interesting ideas and themes of those in major points in history. That way, when you go into the test, you don't have to come up with all of it on the spot. You can have some things to think back to. And two, for the multiple choice, I mean, as you probably know, a lot of it is very, what is this document speaking? What concept is it speaking to? What is the bigger idea here? So make sure, again, you go in with knowing some of the most important like events or documents, like know what they were in the context of, like know about Thomas Paine's Common Sense, know about Lincoln's most important, like the Emancipation Proclamation, stuff like that. Frederick Douglass, those kind of stuff. Know some of those basic stuff, so that way it'll be easier for you to know, like situate yourself, connect to the time period. Last bit of advice for that, you probably also know this, but always, your first thing you should draw your attention to is the year. That's the most important piece of information, because you should be able to, like, it should narrow your focus down so much just by knowing the year something was published in. It'll tell you a lot about the situation. Sometimes it can be misleading because things can be written well after the event happened, but usually these are primary sources. They'll be close to the year. Focus on the year. Okay, so let's start. Some basic pre-Columbian stuff. Can anyone tell me, like this is not a major part of the AP test, so we'll kind of breeze through it. Can anyone tell me what sort of set up our north-south divide? What were the big factors you feel that came from that pre-Columbian era to set up a north-south divide? Because y'all know we ended up in this like whole Civil War thing. But there's got to be something that made the North have a different civilization than the South. So could you tell me what was kind of different about the North versus the South and why? Nathan?
North was more like industrialization based, while the South was agricultural.
That is true. But why did we get there? Because that's kind of what happened in the 1800s. We see industrialization first in the North, and then we have this plantation entrenched aristocracy in the South. But why did we have that? Why did we have the family farms, more yeoman farmers in the north, and especially the northeast and stuff like that, as well as the traders, like the merchants, versus the south, where we had less of that and more of the large plantation, cash crop, stuff like that.
Is it the climate?
Climate. Can you try to think of like a reason why the climate, like you mean based on your basic knowledge of the climate?
Like the south was like warmer, it
That's
had better
the
soil. Like I
the
don't.
most basic answer is the south is warmer. A
Okay,
lot of things
okay.
happen when the south when you're in a warmer place. There's different crops that can be grown in a warmer place with a longer growing season, like sugar, especially in tropical islands, like tobacco, cotton, stuff like that. They just couldn't be grown as easily in the north. North was more subsistence farming. What does that mean? Does anyone know what subsistence farming means?
That's actually a term in AP in geography. So it's like a term where you're making, or you're a farmer that feeds yourself and your family, not for commercial agriculture.
Yes. So like we were already at a point in history by the 16, 1700s where people were selling their produce even in the north and stuff like that. But the farms in the north were mostly for your own consumption. You grew and you ate what you grew, or you ate what you made. Or maybe you did a little bit of trading around your very local area, especially inland in the northern parts of America. Southern parts of America pretty quickly developed away from that towards plantations, towards selling things, selling your goods to Europe. The Columbian Exchange and like the Atlantic Triangle, as you might know about that way. The idea is that you have Europe. We're a European colony, so Europe gives weapons and like metal goods and stuff to Africa. African tribes steal slaves from other tribes and send them in exchange to Europe, to the Americas, and to like Central America and South America in terms of Spain, North America in terms of the British. And then in America, the slaves are used to produce cash crops, which then go back to Europe. That's the basic exchange there. The slave triangle thing. So that's the important thing, the basis, the climate basis of the American divide. Really important thing to touch on if questions about divides in America, which are very popular on AP tests, at least when I was taking it, which is pretty similar to your test, is the idea of having, like, how do you explain different aspects of the North-South divide, or in other ways, the East-West divide. North-South divide is a very climate-driven divide, whereas the East-West divide, since it happened more later, has more to do with like frontier adventurism, manifest destiny, a lot more cultural things within America. But the North-South divide is kind of like who settled where and what did they do because of climate. So North, small farms, less slavery because, again, there were family farms. South, cash crops, lots of slavery because labor intensive. These crops like cotton, all that sort of stuff, very labor intensive. So you more than food crops. You need somebody to work those fields. The people there weren't enough, so you needed slaves. Or I mean, they used slaves. Okay, so what else happened in the north? Not just farming. What happened on the coastlines? Somebody tell me.
Trade.
Trade. Why did trade develop on the northeastern shores? Why do you think?
Their first ally was the UK or Britain. So not normally they would have communication and trade with them.
Exactly. It's a combination of a lot of factors as well as a little bit of luck. The factors, one of the biggest factors is obviously like the people who are settling here, the major settlements are companies like joint stock corporations, whatever, mostly from Great Britain. Like a few Dutch ones, like originally New York was New Amsterdam, things like that. But pretty quickly it becomes the English colonies, English settlements to establish trade with UK and a little bit of France and stuff like that. Either way, think of a map and think of longitude and latitude. Northeastern America is just more proximate than the southern coast. Not only are they more in line latitude-wise, but also if you know America, it kind of slants inwards. So those kind of things look kind of small in a map, those differences, but they are big for seafarers. They're big for shipping and all that sort of stuff. So Northeastern America was a natural place to set up some earlier settlements. This is it's a difficult thing to really figure out why it necessarily had to end up that way, especially because can anyone think why somebody might want, when you're setting up your first colony, why would you want it in the south instead of the north? Can anyone tell me?
The climate is more inviting, like it's not as cold.
Yeah, literally, I think more than half of the Plymouth Rock settlers died in their first year during the winter because of how cold it was and they didn't get food and everything like that. But I mean, I can't say for certain. I don't think many people can say for certain. You should read more about it if you're interested. But I think it was really a balancing act, like the proximity to Great Britain and the European powers, the ease of transport. Also, the focus on trade. Like the South already had the Spanish involved. It had a lot of other things. This was kind of Britain's and France's, Britain and originally the Dutch's area, especially Britain's area of influence now. So it was kind of theirs. So it was a lot easier to deal with things there. And also some of the more southern colonies closer to Virginia, like Roanoke, the original one, failed, things like that. So a little bit of luck there probably. So all those factors kind of coalesce to the north being small farms and on the coastlines, major trade ports. Why is it important when it comes to now let's move forward since I don't want to waste too much time in this pre-revolution time. Why is it important when it comes to the revolution that America has all this merchant class, this fairly wealthy group of merchants, this more capitalist merchant class? What do they contribute to the American Revolution and why it starts?
Would it be like, as a developing country, we need connections with other countries? So those were built by merchants.
So do you mean that as a cause of the revolution or something after the revolution?
I guess after.
Okay, I completely agree that after the revolution, that becomes a very essential part of us establishing a reasonably functional, financially solvent nation. After the revolution, we went into what is basically a depression, an economic depression. And that was very difficult to get out of. As you well know, we had to literally scrap our constitution at that time, the Articles of Confederation, because as a major result, because of our wartime debt and our depression making people very angry. But let's focus first on the causes of the revolution. Can anyone tell me why you think the merchant class fed into the revolution, not just affected the stuff afterwards?
Maybe the many acts like taxes were not very good for trade and it directly harmed those group of people.
Yes, we have to remember that a major thing that was of an uproar of things people were annoyed about was the taxation without representation, or things that controlled people's ability to trade. That was a major gripe people had with Great Britain. And a lot of that would have been disproportionately sourced from the merchant class and the people involved in those trading schemes. You have to remember that kind of now you hear all this story about supply chains, global supply chains getting disrupted, all that sort of stuff, basically, since things are produced in little bits all over the world. It's a lot simpler then, but some of that stuff still exists. You have the merchant class in the shoreline who are annoyed with all of this taxation it's hurting their profits. You have southern cash crop growers who might get a bit more annoyed with a lot of this because they're part of that supply chain. It might hurt them and their sales, the plantation class. There's some people all over the country or of the colony who have some reason to be annoyed with these new taxes. Most importantly, these taxes affected people who were reasonably well off, who were pretty educated and could read and write and stuff like that. And that sort of allowed a disproportionate uproar about this stuff than if it just affected people who were illiterate or people who couldn't write well, or the poorest people. It affected the merchant class. It affected merchant cities. mostly like notably like Boston and New York. It affected these places that had a lot of lawyers and people who could write eloquently, and like basically spell like these, and who had the knowledge and had the schooling of a European. They knew about John Locke and his natural rights. They knew about Montesquieu and his division of powers. They knew about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the ideas he espoused on liberty. So they were, in many cases, children of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment. And so you have this coalescence of harm, the annoyance of Great Britain befalling somewhat upon these people who were also pretty well educated, and in cities where there were educated people who could write well and convince the world, I mean the colony, to get up in arms about this stuff. So understand that kind of the parallel attributes there that kind of come together to make this revolution take more of a hold. Can anyone tell me how the French and Indian War / the 7 Years' War contributed to the revolution?
So I think it led to the Quartering Act, and so the people didn't like that.
Yes, that was one aspect. The idea, like they basically forced Americans to house British troops, which is like, again, part of this, like, you don't just start a revolution because your government does one annoying thing. It's because they do a lot of annoying things, and you start to feel like, why am I listening to these people that I have no say in? Why am I listening to these people across the sea, across an ocean? We're doing fine ourselves. We're making everything ourselves. Why do they keep abridging my rights whenever they feel like it? So one piece of it, which wouldn't be enough alone, but together make something, is like forcing people to have troops in their house, which indirectly leads to the Third Amendment, which bans the forcible quartering of troops in the Bill of Rights. That's one bit of it. Also, can anyone else tell me something as a product of the French and Indian War?
Well, isn't it like it left Britain in a lot of debt and they tried to put it on the colonies?
Exactly. So they raised a lot of those initial taxes. You should look up the exact ones. I can't remember the specific ones off the top of my head. But those initial taxes, I think like the Stamp Act, I think the Sugar Act too, but you should check on that, as a reaction to that. They raised those initial things as like, okay, this war was really for you guys, so you should be like, we had troops there fighting on your behalf, so you need to pay for it. And like some of that's posturing, some of it was just because the debt was so big. Like this was, for some people say this was the First World War. I think actually like Winston Churchill has a famous quote saying that the 7 Years' War was the First World War, and it kind of was, because it was fought in India, it was fought in the West Indies, in America, in Europe, everywhere. So it's a very expensive war for Britain. They raise taxes, just like you said, and then annoys people. Most importantly, it annoys people in a positive feedback cycle. It's not just like war, debt, causes taxes, causes revolution. It's war, causes debt, causes taxes, causes some annoyance, like the Sons of Liberty, which were kind of like a very kind of an extremist group. They started to do things like the Boston Tea Party, which then causes Britain to clamp down even further with having more troops and more control, and the Intolerable Acts and stuff like that, and the Homes Act and stuff like that. And then more annoyance, like you see like Thomas Paine, and you see like George Washington, like some major figures start to express discontent. And then like it's a positive feedback cycle that eventually, like the First Continental Congress, then that eventually leads to the Second Continental Congress, Declaration of Independence, and war. So don't think of revolution as like the third grade conception of it, is that Britain did these annoying things to us, so we started a war. It's Britain did small annoying things. We fought back, or we got annoyed by them. Then Britain did a more annoying things in reaction to that. So then we got more aggressive about that. It's a cycle. Revolutions rarely just come out of nowhere. They usually build up like this. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, so that's another story. Again, like history is, it's difficult to understand. The information is somewhat sparse. The stories are yours to interpret, but I'm just telling you some information and some thematic ideas you can stitch together, especially if you're doing the AP test. but they're interesting otherwise. Any questions up till that start of the revolution? Does anyone have like a pre-revolutionary US history joke?
I don't think I have any jokes about US history.
Really?
Could you
What about Aaron Burr? You guys don't know about Hamilton the musical? Oh, that was such a big thing when I was in like 9th and 10th grade. Never mind.
is Aaron Burr the one who was shot in the duel?
No,
Or did
What?
he? What?
Aaron Burr was the one who shot Alexander Hamilton.
Oh,
Like my year was obsessed with that musical. Like you couldn't go like 20 minutes without having to hear the song. It's an amazing musical. You should watch it on Disney Plus. I give it a 9.5. Anyways, yeah, watch that. Anyway, so let's get to the revolution. Blah blah blah, blue 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 about the war. I mean, like, major things about the war. You start the war pretty slow off initially. Washington does kind of badly initially. It starts off in Northeast, America, like with Lexington and Concord, holding the fort. Actually, a few buildings down where I am, like Washington set up camp in Harvard Yard, in Massachusetts Hall, I think, when they were trying to hold Boston and hold this city. Anyway, loses a lot of battles to General Cornwallis. Some initial victories. He has untrained troops, much smaller force, much more ragtag, but they have some better tactics. Like, they're not just like standing, shooting in a line. They're a bit more experimental, a little more guerrilla about it. They know the landscape, they know how to hide behind trees, stuff like that. Population is still initially kind of split on a lot of this stuff. A lot of like 50% loyalists, 50% patriots. Patriots are people who support New America. I know it's a bit of a biased term, but whatever. I think there were more loyalists in the South. Bye, James. Thanks for coming. More loyalists in the South, but that's like not a super important detail. Anyways, we have that initial phase of the war. Eventually, Washington starts to get a better hold of his troops. More people join up, like casual farmers, because that's like what the militia is composed of. The experienced troops are better at this point. And like you have a lot of like very big propaganda, like how Washington crossing the Delaware was like a draw or a minor victory, but it's made out to be this massive thing. So the support for the war manages to hold. Biggest thing was probably the siege of Yorktown, and a lot of those things convincing the French to really get on board, and all of that. Eventually, Cornwallis surrenders in Charleston, or no, in Yorktown, and the war drags on for a few more years, but it's pretty low key after that. So those are the main details. As you know, the initial aftermath of that is the Articles of Confederation. Does anyone remember what were some key characteristics of the Articles of Confederation?
It was a weak, like, main government. Most of the power was given to the states. Like, central government couldn't tax or like
Exactly.
regulate trade and stuff.
Yep, completely right, Nathan. So the central government didn't have taxing powers. They basically had to ask states for money if they wanted it. Obviously, no, like why would a state give the central government money? Every state had their own debt also. There wasn't like a central bank. So every state had their own war debt. And as you will find out, having a bunch of separate debts makes for a lot more shaky of a financial system than one centralized institution, which might be more reliable to pay off those debts. Like these debts are to like banks in Europe and on banks in America and all over the place. So we have all those debts, which become a problem. Having uncentralized debts makes for a weak financial system. You have these states who can't pay it off. They have to raise taxes for themselves. They're not able to pay Revolutionary War soldiers and stuff like that for many years because of these financial woes. You have this depression because America has all these debts and the economy kind of, was in like war mode. A lot of rebuilding has to be done. So a lot of factors come together. Like harvests weren't great, I think, in the 80s. And the system doesn't really work. And especially it doesn't work because the federal government doesn't have any power to centralize the debts to deal with the situation. They don't have the ability to pay their troops. They don't have a military. They can't regulate trade. You have a very weak head of state. You need unanimous or near unanimous consent to make most decisions. And every state has one representative. Every one of the colonies has one representative, so 13 representatives. So that doesn't really seem fair to a lot of people that like New York has the same number of representatives as like Delaware. Because New York's way more populous. Okay, so with all those problems, you might have heard of like Shays Rebellion in Boston, where this like farmer Daniel Shay, very upset he didn't get paid for the war effort. He like stormed the courthouse with a small militia. Massachusetts has to arrange a state militia to go and fight them back. But anyway, we're starting to see the seedlings of revolt and some major problems. So they gather the Constitutional Convention to basically ditch the articles, rewrite it. What are the main principles of the Constitution? Let's go a few of the main articles because it's important to have a good basis of the Constitution. What is Article 1 about? Okay. Article 1, the legislative. Article that's like the beginning part, the preamble.
No, okay.
Article 1, legislative branch. So it just basically spells out what our legislature should look like, what the Congress should look like. Most important aspects of this is one, it is way more powerful than ever before. It has the Commerce Clause, the interstate and foreign commerce clauses. So it can regulate trade within the states and set there's no tariffs between the states. It's like one trade union. And two, it has the things like the taxing clause, which allows it to levy taxes like taxing and spending. It can levy taxes upon people. 3, it has the necessary and proper clause, which is important because it basically gives it this more open-ended usage of these powers than ever before in history. It can do a lot of different stuff. It's not so like limited to specific things it can do and specific things it can do. It can do what is necessary and proper to fulfill those above clauses like commerce and whatever. So legislature is more powerful. And then another important aspect is the idea of the compromise, that you have the House which has proportional representation, to the population of the states, as our House of Representatives still does now. And then you have the Senate, which has 2 people per state. So that way it's a compromise between both systems. Personally, I don't think it's really that much of a compromise. I feel like the people, the pro-Senate small state people won because, they still have to approve everything, but whatever. Okay, there we go. That's the system. Article 2, executive branch of the Constitution of the executive branch, describes the role of this presidency. Much more powerful than under the articles, but still pretty weak, especially compared to what the presidency has become today. Just a side question. Can anyone tell me, just off the top of your head, what president or presidents do you think were had the biggest role in expanding the scope of the presidency, making the presidency more powerful? I'll give you a hint. They're usually the ones somehow end up getting regarded as the best presidents in history. I think correctly, but.
So like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln is the biggest example. Abraham Lincoln fundamentally changed the scope of the presidency. During the Civil War, he just took control of a lot more of the economy and of the powers. He didn't wait for Congress to say everything what it needed to do. He made executive decisions. He commanded the military at a much closer level. It didn't really let the states control it individually. All sorts of stuff. Abraham Lincoln significantly increased the power of the presidency. George Washington, since he was the first, I don't think he really increased the scope because he was kind of the one who set the initial scope of the presidency. But yeah, he was a more powerful than some of the presidents that came after him. So just briefly, you have a few of the initial presidents. They weren't necessarily the most powerful in their role as president, but they were so important in the founding of the country and setting of the original norms that they have a lot of power through that. Like George Washington, one of his biggest contributions was like the simple act of his farewell address, the famous George Washington farewell address, which I would ask you guys to check out briefly on your own time, or a summary of it. But the basic idea there is he voluntarily leaves his post after 2 terms, which sets this norm that president is not a king. President will leave office after 2 terms, even though that's not in the Constitution. He sets that norm. You have Thomas Jefferson, who sets up major trade relationships with like France and stuff like that, and sets up like the Louisiana Purchase, things like that. Since again, like this is all in the wind here. You have James Madison, of course, who was like a foundational constitutional scholar, all those kinds of stuff. Then you have a string of, I'd say, worse and worse presidents for a while. You have a few good ones. You have, I mean, like good is a difficult term, but like you have important presidents like Andrew Jackson. He's commonly maligned, but like, you know, did a lot of pretty major stuff in terms of expanding westward and being like changing the president, the character of the presidency to be more of the people. Like he's a man of the people and more of a populist kind of. Changes the ethos of America from the Federalist Party, the New Englanders, the high scholar types, to more of the military general like of America, like, you know, understanding the farmer and understanding the average person. That's the kind of person is who Andrew Jackson was, and he changed that from the previous presidents. Then you have like James Polk, comes in the late in the 40s. Big focus on manifest destiny, expansion, getting all the, like, you know, the Mexican American War, getting the Mexican Cession, which includes like California, New Mexico, a lot of that area, to southern Texas. And he expands like through acquisitions through too. All sorts of stuff, James Polk. Then you have some pretty bad presidents that kind of lead directly into the Civil War. You have like Buchanan, famously terrible president. All those people who didn't really avoid that. Anyway, you have Abraham Lincoln, like star, like, you know, diamond in the rough. Really manages to show what a president can be. Like widely regarded usually as the greatest president in American history, keeps the Union together. Then after that, you have a string of generally mediocre to bad presidents again. Not necessarily all bad, but definitely weak. They tend to all be Republicans, same party as Lincoln. Republican means something very different today than it did then. But they're like generally still like pro-business, stuff like that. So they kind of take a back seat, weaker presidencies. Some were kind of bad, quite bad, like Andrew Johnson immediately after Lincoln. Does anyone remember what Andrew Johnson did? He was the vice president of Lincoln, and then he got promoted when Lincoln got assassinated. And he was the guy who was a Southerner. Lincoln added him in 1864, as a Southerner to help him get elected, to make him more electable. But Andrew Johnson had much less care about slavery. He didn't really have this like strong moral opposition. He didn't really feel like African Americans should be given like tremendous amounts of rights or stuff like that. So he significantly reduced the scope of Reconstruction in the South, and probably made it a lot worse in terms of like it allowed a lot of the wounds of the antebellum, that is pre-Civil War period. Antebellum means that. A lot of the wounds of the slavery antebellum period, he allowed them to fester and continue having effects all the way to the current day. A lot of that can be attributed to having a poor Reconstruction, which didn't go aggressively, when we had the opportunity, aggressively try to redress some of the sins of slavery. So that's an important name and an important concept to keep in your heads. The issue of slavery, the issues of the North-South divide will definitely come up in some form on your test. And it's important to think about the what ifs, like what caused the South and North to diverge, like originally climate, like you said, Nathan, eventually industrialization, like you also said, but also what caused things to stay as they were or caused things to change. What caused things to stay as they were? People like James Buchanan and Andrew Johnson, who didn't really try to make radical change. They kind of just try to make compromises and tried to make limited steps. People who caused major change, people like obviously Abraham Lincoln, who said when the South seceded, say, no, you can't do that. We're gonna declare war and we're gonna stop this rebellion. That sort of stuff. So make sure you understand both sides of that story. What caused the Union to kind of fall apart? What caused it to get back together? And probably an equally important part of this is what caused its divisions to just get the can gets kicked down the road. Like so often the can just got kicked down the road. Like somebody else can deal with this. Does any of you remember the Missouri Compromise? Way back when? Basically,
Yeah.
I mean, there were like two of them, but the basic idea was let's just draw a line and right under Missouri and use that to divide slave and free states so that there's an equal number and representation in the Senate doesn't change. Or the gag rule, which basically said Congress will forbid itself from discussing the issue of slavery or the slave trade. It basically kicking the can down the road. So remember that it is not necessarily the only sins in our political history or our history in general are people doing actively bad things that cause problems. Probably the bigger category of sins in our history are doing nothing when there are problems and allowing them to fester and become these terrible infections. Think of like an infected wound. That's what it becomes, and that's what the division between the North and the South became through all of this. I'm not saying there was any other way to solve that divide. Like it's very difficult for me to guess what would have happened if they had people who were more willing to deal with it earlier and to deal with the issue of slavery. But at the same time, it's important to realize how those things like the Missouri Compromise and the gag rule and the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, which said that this guy was this African American was somebody else's property and had to be returned to them. All those things combined together represent kicking the can down the road. All of them were in the idea of even if we don't like slavery, we don't want to raise too many problems. We don't want to raise too much heck. So let's calm the waters. Eventually, that didn't work at all, as we all know, with the Civil War and 670,000 people dying, soldiers dying, many more civilians. Okay, so that's some of the important presidencies of the 18th century. If we're talking about important presidents, 19th century, sorry, important presidencies of the 20th century, can anyone tell me some? That really changed the role of the president.
When?
The 20th century, so 1900 to 1999. There should be one that should just be the automatic answer at first.
Is it FDR?
FDR. Tell me about FDR. What did he do?
He was during World War I.
He was the longest serving president in American history, like 13, 14 years. He started in 1932 and he died in 1944, 45, early 45 or something like that. He was reelected. He was elected 4 times to the office. Only person ever to have more than 2 terms. And after he finished that, they made a rule, like an actual constitutional amendment, which banned running more than twice. I think it's a 22nd amendment. Anyway, FDR. What is we're jumping around a bit, but whatever. Tell me, what are the big ideas of the Great Depression? This is a very important period in American history. Remember, for some context, you have World War I, which America basically is on the winning side, but it's not like the biggest deal. You also have the Spanish flu at the same time at the end of World War I, which killed way more people. The Spanish flu, you might have heard people talk about it more recently in the context of COVID. Anyways, so you have that, and then you have the Roaring 20s. Roaring 20s, it's called that because everything seemed to be going great. You had some kind of bad presidents like Warren G. Harding, like those kind of people, Calvin Coolidge. But forget about the presidents. The economy is booming. The stock market is like doubling and then doubling again and then doubling again. Everything seems to be great. Rich people are getting so much richer. Companies are doing great. The amount of technology people have access to is great. Everywhere is getting electricity now and electric lighting. Cities are becoming vibrant at night. Things are changing. Radio is becoming popular. All these technologies seem to be making people's lives better. People are loving it. First signs of problems in the 20s is in agriculture, the Dust Bowl. Does anyone remember the Dust Bowl? Dust Bowl is basically, like, there's a lot of causes, contributing causes, but the general idea is it stems from over farming. That people, especially in the southern Midwest area, were planting the same crop over and over again. They were overusing the land, and a principal aspect of farming is alternating crops, so that you 1 year will have like part of your field be like a resource intensive crops that require like corn, which requires a lot of nutrients, and then the next year or two it'll be like legumes and stuff like that, which can help resettle the soil and help the soil reform itself. But people were just planting the same crops over and over again, and that causes the soil to like lose its adhesion, lose its stickiness to the ground. And one, it causes the crops to fail, but two, it also causes the soil to get easily blown around and created this massive like dust clouds in the southern Midwest, especially, which were like pretty terrible. So that sort of thing is part of the story about why agriculture was hitting like pretty bad times. Farmers were hitting bad times. Probably a bigger part of the story has to do with farming technology. Can anyone tell me, why do you think improved farming technology would have made things worse for farmers? Can anyone make a guess how that could happen?
Is it like farmers were overproducing crops, so like the market grew smaller?
Exactly. Farmers were the market didn't change, but the supply chain, like you probably haven't done econ yet, but the supply increased while the demand stays the same. And if the supply of something increases, supply of jobs, supply of vegetables, supply of whatever, while the demand stays the same, what happens to the price? Anyone guess? Does the price go up or the price goes down?
Down.
Down. If you have more of something to sell and the same number of people want to buy it, well, you got to lower the price. Otherwise, no one's going to buy your stuff. So the prices go down. And these farmers had already invested in new land. They'd invested in new technologies, like early tractors and stuff even. And now they were getting in big debt problems. Banks were now having a lot of farmers being like defaulting. What does defaulting mean? Anyone know? Defaulting means somebody can't pay back their loans. You default on your loan if you can't pay it back. You default on your mortgage if you can't pay it back. And then the bank will seize your collateral. So usually in a mortgage, that's your own house. So if you can't pay your mortgage, the bank will take your house. So they were defaulting on their loans for their farms and stuff like that, which means like banks would like have to seize people's farms and stuff like that. But that's useless to a bank. Like it's fine if a few people default and then they can just resell the farms or resell the equipment to somebody else. But if a lot of farmers are defaulting, what happens? What happens to the banks? Instead of being paid money, they have a lot of farms and farming equipment. What were you going to say?
They ran out of money?
Yeah, like they basically, instead of having money, they have these things like farming equipment and farms they should theoretically be able to sell for money. Except the problem is that farmers are doing terribly, so the prices of all those farms and farming equipment are very low now. So they've lost a lot of money because they gave out these loans that were never paid back, and they now have all these very like cheap and useless like farms and farming equipment they can't sell to anyone. Does that make sense how that can be a problem?
Yeah.
That is the exact same problem that happened in 2008, in the 2008 Great Recession, the housing market bubble. A big part of why things kind of fell apart as terribly as they did is banks had given a lot of loans out to these people who could not pay back their loans on their houses. So like you get like, how does a mortgage work? Does anyone want to tell me how a mortgage works?
Like you borrow money from the bank and pay it back with interest.
Yeah, basically the bank buys your house for you through a loan, and then you pay it back over like many, many years with interest. But with the housing market bubble in 2008, you had this situation where people had borrowed like money that they did not have the means to pay back. They did not have what we call the credit rating or something to pay it back. They just didn't earn enough money, or they weren't consistent enough or stuff like that. So all these people had all this they bought all these houses. Banks had given out the loans. They thought the house, like the idea was banks were fine doing that in both instances because they thought the prices can't go down. They thought like, oh, the market is booming. It's only going to go up. So even if a few people default on their loans, I get the land or I get the house, and it's going to sell for an even higher price. So why am I really concerned? Like, I'm not going to lose money either way. Does that make sense? That logic?
Yeah.
Okay. To focus, like in the 1920s, it wasn't just farmland and stuff like that. It was all sorts of land. It was this big practice called land speculation, which was basically you had a bunch of rich people who were or companies and stuff like that, who'd bought up a lot of land in a lot of undeveloped areas of the country, especially like Florida and stuff like that, which was like they just got the land without really knowing what was on the land or whether it could ever be viable for farming or industrial production or whatever. And then eventually people found out, oh wait, this land's kind of useless. Like some of it's like swampland and all that sort of stuff. They didn't really know what was going on with this land. So they bought all this land because land prices were shooting through the roof. So they were speculating. They were like, okay, I think this land's going to become more valuable. And I just, market's growing. Why don't I do this? And then eventually comes crashing down once everyone realizes that these stuff are overvalued. And then these people start to go underwater on their loans. That means they can't pay back the loans. So they just default. Or one thing is that some people can't pay back the loans. That's a major problem. Like at that time, it was loans on land, loans on farming equipment, loans on farmland. They couldn't pay back the loan, so the bank gets it. Another problem is going underwater on your loans, especially in 2008, going underwater on your mortgage. It's a slightly different concept. What that involves is not necessarily you don't have the means to pay back your loan. Think of it this way. Let me restate this. Imagine you had a mortgage where you took a loan of $1 million to pay for your big fancy house. Okay? And you took that loan of $1 million, and now your house used to be worth $1.2 million. So you were great. Like you could even if you wanted, you could sell your house and make a $200,000 profit because you have to pay back the mortgage, but you get 1.2 million. Does that make sense? How if your house is worth 1.2 million, that's like all great for you. You're happy to pay that mortgage because it's a profitable venture, profitable asset. But now imagine housing price or land prices crater. No one wants land. No one wants housing anymore. And now that house you had, which was worth 1.2 million, is now worth $500,000. Now, if that were you, Cody, would you still keep paying your $1 million loan off, or would you just give up?
I'd probably give up.
Yeah, because like if your house is only worth $500,000, why would you pay $1 million for it? You're still paying $1 million loan. It would be easier for you to just default on your loan, give up, let the bank have your house, and then like buy something else for a much more reasonable price, if at all, or maybe rent or something. Does that make sense? So both of those things together, not being able to pay back your loans, and then once prices start to fall on land and housing and everything, going underwater on your mortgages or your loans, such that you just want to give up on the property, that really hurts banks, like Nathan was alluding to. That the bank now has all these assets, these stuff like farming equipment, land, houses, whatever, and they lost a lot of money because those things which they thought would be super valuable are now not valuable at all. So they've lost a lot of money because no one wants to buy these things from them. So it lost a lot of money. Okay, that's just an important like connection throughout history. You see this a lot where speculation causes that is like speculation. Investors buying things for overprices, like they buy things for too high prices, or without really knowing what their asset is. Like they don't know what the land in Florida is like. They don't know if it's good farmland or swampland. Speculation is what you have right now with Bitcoin, or a lot of like, high growth, like startups and stuff like that. Those are speculative assets. So that thing is a continuous thing throughout history. The Great Recession involved it. Current day, like crypto involves it. Great Depression involved it. You see it in the panic of like 1890 something or whatever. You see this in a lot of events, even in the 1800s and things like that. So another important undercurrent of history, investment speculation, where the market's growing great, but it's a bubble. People are putting money into like buying up things that aren't actually useful things. They're bad pieces of land or stuff like that. And once people realize that the system is rotten, that the land is bad, or that the assets are bad, then everything comes crashing down. Because the prices fall, you go underwater on your loans. People can't pay back their loans. Banks are hurt. When banks lose money, what do? They stop lending out new money. If a bank is losing money, they don't want to lend out money. They don't have the money to lend out. And what happens when a bank can't lend out money? Who gets hurt? Can anyone tell me? Who uses
People.
bank loans? What?
Like the people
Yeah, well, what do people use bank loans for?
to buy big like investments.
Exactly. So people can't get houses, or even things like washing machines and stuff like that. They can't get household goods that they would usually get a loan on. Even people who would pay back their loans responsibly, they can't get loans anymore, or they get terrible deals on loans. Also, probably a bigger deal than just people are companies. A major aspect of the economy is companies getting big loans from banks to build build a factory or invest in some major new project that they'll eventually pay back from the profits of those projects. So companies get really hurt. What is the problems those cause? Well, if companies can't invest in new factories, stuff like that, that means they're going to hire less people. That means they're going to downsize. That means they're not going to like people are going to lose their jobs. Unemployment goes up. Consumers are hurt. That like when people can't get loans for their houses or products, stuff like that, that means they're going to buy less stuff. That means their demand on the economy becomes lower. And that means companies become worse off because people aren't buying their stuff anymore. So those companies will lay off even more people. They'll raise their prices. There'll be like all these problems there. And overall, that means a lot of people lose their jobs. A lot of people are way worse off. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when people lose their jobs, then they buy even less stuff, which means the companies hurt even more. And then they fire even more people, and it becomes a problem. So the Great Depression was a huge snowballing effect of a lot of these different things. Stock market crash in 1929, bad monetary policy from the Federal Reserve, which we won't go into. The speculation we just talked about, then the crash in the Dust Bowl and all those different things. It's like a big amalgam of all of this, and that just kind of rolling down a hill, snowballing up. And then bing, bang, bongo, by like 1933 or whatever, you have 25% unemployment, highest ever, ridiculously high unemployment. That means 1 in 4 people, not 1 in 4 people didn't work. Because right now, if you go on the street, 40% of people don't work. That's just a true fact, because like children, because of the elderly, because of people who are like stay-at-home parents, things like that. But of people who want to work at that time, 1 in 4 of them, people who needed to have a job, they did not have a job. That's crazy. Today, that's closer to 1 in 25 people who want to work, don't have a job. Huge difference. Okay? Just understand Great Depression, crazy big, crazy big. Anyway, so that's another undercurrent of history. Understand the economic aspect of things, how speculation, how investment is interlinked with everything from the Great Depression to the Great Recession more recently, to the panic of the 1830s and of the 1890s. You should read more about those. I won't go into that. To even like the original colonies, if that comes up in an FRQ or something like that, you can connect it back to the joint stock corporations, where Great Britain basically were investing in colonies as an investment, as a speculative investment. Can we grow stuff there Can we sell it back to Europe? Can we make money off of these colonies? So economics, and especially the economics of investment and speculation, have been a major undercurrent throughout American history. And it's an important thing that you can use to connect between periods. Oh, wait, any questions? Are there any specific topics you guys want to go over? Okay. For now, then I will stick to a few other themes you just should make sure you get in your head. So we've talked about the big theme of like revolution, why it came about, how it was built up too slowly. We've talked about the themes about the North-South divide, like the early climate divide, the different types of agriculture and the merchant class in the North. And then also, as Nathan said, we have this another major theme we have to talk about, which is part of the North-South divide, but probably the big one, I would say maybe the biggest thing in American history. Probably not the biggest thing in APUSH, but definitely important. That is the history of industrialization and its effect on America. Industrialization, basically everywhere in the world that it happened, was the fundamental transformative shift in every country. Industrialization changed everything. Like, you could say America started in 1776, but America as we knew it really started with industrialization. America in 1776 would be pretty unrecognizable to us today, but America in 1886 would be a lot more recognizable. What does industrialization cause in a state or in a country? Can anyone tell me what are the big effects of industrialization?
The economy.
The economy. What do you mean by that?
I mean, like production, like infrastructure.
Yes, factories, those kinds of stuff start to be built, like actual infrastructure to make things like goods, textiles, clothing, eventually other goods like arms manufacturing. A big arms manufacturing thing emerges after the Civil War or during the Civil War because America spent so much money trying to develop that sort of stuff. The Civil War actually ended up helping American industrialization a lot. America industrializes pretty early. Great Britain's where industrialization starts in the late 1700s. America starts industrializing in the early to mid 1800s. So we're pretty early in the system. But what you said about economics is correct. You really start to see industrialization actually grow the economy. Like the economy is pretty static throughout most of human history. But you actually start to see people's real income, their actual like the things they can buy becomes more and more with industrialization because people are starting to earn wages, all that sort of stuff. But let's touch back to that idea of factories and factory infrastructure. What does that cause when you start to have these centralized locations where people have to work? What sort of effects does that have?
Like labor.
Like, tell me a huge part of the history and on the AP test is being able to tell the story. What is the before and after? Before some technology or some new intervention or some president, what was it like? What were the problems? What were the stuff that weren't working? And how did the technology change it for the better or for the worse? What were the things afterwards? Before and after. So tell me, before, I'll tell you the before. Before industrialization, sparsely populated. You had some cities on the coast, which were like merchant cities, but pretty sparsely populated. Most people lived on farms. People just worked where they lived. Both men and women shared responsibilities on that sort of thing. They didn't have wages. They just kind of ate what they made. In the South, people made a lot of money. Rich people made a lot of money off the plantations, but most of the workers didn't make any money because they were slaves. But that's all there. Tell me then, how would the concept, be creative here, how the concept of having a centralized factory building and all that sort of stuff change the game, change that before into what happens after?
So it would be like more densely populated areas and like more diverse populations.
Exactly. So you have densely populated areas. That's the first big thing to understand. You have basically agglomeration and urbanization. People try to start to move to cities because you don't have like a bunch of little factories. That's called like a cottage industry. That used to be a thing, but that's not industrialization. Industrialization is big factories using water power and eventually steam power and all that sort of stuff. You don't have like a million different factories at each farm. You have a few factories in big cities, and they got good jobs. They have consistent wages. Your living doesn't depend on whether your crops succeed or not based on the weather when you work in a factory. Does that make sense why people might want to work in a factory then? More stuff. Tell me more. What does a factory really change the game for people's lives?
Work became more straightforward and like easier, I guess.
So easier is hard to say. For some people, yes. For a lot of other people, no. Because work, especially manufacturing back then, not regulated at all. Extremely long hours, often very dangerous working conditions, and hazardous stuff. I would not be surprised if on either the multiple choice or the DBQ, you get primary sources about work in manufacturing and stuff like that, because that's the sort of thing they like to do. So make sure you have some understanding of the life changes like you seem to do. So you're completely right though. Work might not get easier or harder, but it does become more monotonous. And you start to have this sense of time control. Like you clock in at like 9, and then 9 in the morning, you clock out at 8. So your schedule starts to become regulated. It's not what you want to do when you want to do it. On a farm, like, obviously there's some things you have to do seasonally, but it's really when you want to do your work. Whereas in a factory, you have to do it at a certain time. Tell me about wages. How do you think wages change people's lives, especially in the North? Because remember, always think of the before and after picture. What did we have before wages? What did it look like? Somebody tell
It
me.
was all like very dependent on the year, like whether you got good crops that year or not.
Yeah, so that's one part of it. There's a lot more risk involved in your life. Like you could like starve, and your family could starve if you got a bad season and your crops didn't grow. But also more than that, you just didn't really need to involve yourself in trading, and merchants involve themselves in trading and stuff like that. Like you did most of the stuff yourself. You built your house yourself. You managed your farm yourself. You grew your own food and all that sort of stuff. But now, when the entire concept of money and you making your livelihood off of a wage means that you have to choose what to buy now. So when there becomes this option, like that people, like a bunch more people now have money to spend, they're actually using money rather than just like growing their own food. What sort of industries will thrive now that money becomes more prominent?
Probably like textile industries.
Yes, and especially think about retailers and stuff like that. Like, having convenience stores start to thrive, and like retailers, things that sell food, grocery stores, things like that start to emerge. Like obviously like farmers would just sell to each other, stuff like that. And eventually like restaurants and a consumer culture emerge in the late 1800s out of this, out of people having wages and they live in cities. So people want to spend their money. And initially it's on food, but eventually they have some leftover money for leisure. And then the department stores emerge out of this. You go to one place, you can buy all your clothes and buy all your necessities and plates and all that sort of stuff. Does that make sense? How wages help contribute to that like retail establishment, which is like super central in America today.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's wages and having that sort of impact. One second, grab a drink. Okay, so we have that aspect of how things progressed. How do you think urbanization? So that you said urbanization, like people living in more densely populated areas. How do you think that changed the American ethos? what were the effects of urbanization on America? Remember, this happens slowly, is like, and more aggressively in like the Northeast, like New York, and Boston, starting in like 1840s, 1850s. But it really like becomes a super fast in like the 1870s to 1880s. So tell me, what does urbanization do?
Like it got a lot more diverse. Like a lot of new people interacted with each other.
That is true. So people would have interacted with quite a bit more people than they did ever before. Like if you live on a farm, you're not going to see that many people. You're probably going to see more cows in your lifetime than other people. But in a city, you have to interact with a lot of people. And that kind of paralleled the simultaneously the spikes in immigration that started in the late 1820s to 1840s, like Irish immigration, German immigration, all these different ways of immigration. And then like in the like 60s, 1860s, 1880s, you see higher levels of Chinese immigration on the West Coast, all that sort of stuff. Another theme, this is a separate thing, but another theme of American history is the waves of immigration, how they're dealt with at first. This could also easily be some of your questions are about like a primary source on immigration, like an immigrant's like account of it or something. So important things about immigration. One, almost every wave of immigration, no matter where they were from, were initially met with like the locals being pretty annoyed about it and hating the immigrants, whether it was because of the different customs or culture, or think they were lazy, or whatever, racism, or just like, you know, general like stupidity or misconceptions about the other people. Always there. Like nowadays we think of that in the context of like Central and South American, Mexican immigration most recently, because those have been the main places of immigration recently. But it was the exact same thing you saw in the 20s to the 40s with like the Know Nothing Party and all those kinds of stuff, where there was very aggressive local anti-immigrant sentiment about Irish people, and then about Germans. And then in the 60s to the 80s, it eventually became about Chinese people, and led to the Chinese Exclusion Acts to limit immigration from those places. And then later on in the early 1900s, it was against Eastern Europeans. So it's always been there. So understand that there's that, like, again, the test makers of the AP test love to do parallels in history, bring about parallels and themes, and that come multiple times in history, where history rhymes. That's actually, like, I think it's a good way of testing it, but you'll do a lot better, especially on the free response questions, if you understand those parallels, and understand the before and after, the cause and effect aspect of this. Okay, so anyway, that's immigration. Well, let's go back to urbanization. How do you think urbanization changes public health? Do you think health improves or health gets worse?
Probably get worse.
Yes, it's a complicated story because, like I said, like food supply becomes a bit more stable. If you're not like dependent on the climate, food supply becomes a bit more stable and easy to get. But at the same time, can anyone tell me the sorts of diseases which would spread more in an urbanized area? Is it like hunger? Is it heart disease? Is it
Probably like germs.
germs, viruses, bacteria? They kill so many people in the early cities, especially in the mid 1800s. It's really only towards the end of the 1800s you start to see technologies to address this. Like you have big cholera epidemics in like New York in like the 40s and 50s, of the 1840s and 1850s and stuff like that. So understand that aspect of urbanization, the public health aspect. Who knows? People might write questions about that after COVID. What technologies do you think help really, like, super helpful in reducing death rates in cities? Do you remember any of them, or can you think of any? What are the most common things, technologies you guys use regularly, which help deal with making things more sanitary?
Soap, hand sanitizer.
Well, I don't know if they use hand sanitizer, but it's soap, like hand washing, that sort of thing. That emerges. Biggest thing, easily probably, is pit toilets, or basically having like toilets, like, you know, not having open defecation and stuff on streets and everything. That's a huge shift. It saves so many lives, so much less bacterial infection, so much less of that. Another big thing is is having like dealing with contamination in wells and using well water and stuff like that, and like helping, like, testing to make sure that like wells weren't like having some sort of disease or stuff, like, so like epidemiological tracking by the cities to make sure that water is safe and stuff like that. So all the sort of things like plumbing, basic toilets, washing hands eventually, which was an odd thing, well water that was cleaned and stuff like that. All those things help end those major problems. And obviously later in the 20th century, we start to get medication like penicillin and stuff like that, which help out too. Okay, so back to urbanization. What do you think the effect of urbanization is on the role of women in society? Or effective industrialization and urbanization on women in society. Go on.
So like men were no longer home to take care of the kids. So that was more of the woman's job, maybe?
Yeah, so I'm not like, I'm not like gonna tell you this false narrative that like men and women were considered equal before industrialization, because that's not true at all. But we do have to get out of the mindset that it's always been like it's been until recently. Like, I think we all just kind of get the idea like, oh, until very recently, it's been the case that women like generally like were like at home with the kids. The dad goes out to work and stuff like that, because that's like the conception of work in like the 1950s or the 1920s or whatever. But historically, like deeper into history, like when you live on a family farm, mom's got to work, dad's got to work, sisters got to work, brothers got to work, everyone's got to work, and from when they're very young. Everyone does different things, so like there's gender specific jobs and stuff like that, and definitely women were not really allowed in the political sphere. They were more in charge of like managing the kids and everything. But we have to understand that the things really take a big shift when women are more about like maintaining the home, more supposed to be like in charge of the children and everything, and the men are supposed to go out and work. Often women still work, but they work in different places, like in clothing factories and stuff like that. Some of the worst working conditions are for young single women who need jobs. They have terrible working conditions in these like textile factories, everything like that. So that change is important. That's called the cult of domesticity, as men are brought out to the factories, whereas women start to stay more away, work, don't do stuff with the men and things like that. What is the effect of urbanization on children? Because like being a child on a farm where you're supposed to work and stuff like that must be very different. And maybe your mom teaches you, must be very different from being a child in school, where maybe you're with mom, maybe mom is out working at some like textile thing or whatever. What are you supposed to do? Well, initially, it becomes a pretty big problem in the mid 19th century. So like if you go back in like primary source documents, you can see evidence of like kids just like roving around cities in gangs of like, little children, like, because they didn't have school, they didn't know how to read or whatever. They would just like do things with other kids. Like they didn't have like fields to play in or whatever. And like, they were weird. I don't even know. It's like, kind of kids raising other kids, like things like Lord of the Flies style a bit, if you read that. So eventually people like start to think this is a big problem, that kids are like kind of going crazy and not like getting proper intimacy and attention. So that's when like schools really start, like public schools, mandatory public schools start to emerge as a very popular idea. So you have like Horace Mann, like major people who start to like move in that direction. And eventually you start to get kids going to school. So a big reason you have mandatory public schools and everything is because of urbanization, because kids aren't just living on farms and stuff anymore, far from everything, with them like working on the farm and stuff like that. They have nothing to do anymore. They can't, like, until you're like 12, you can't really work in a factory. 12-year-olds did work in factories and stuff like that, but like younger than that, what are you supposed to do? So they go to school. And eventually that age goes up and up and up when kids are expected to start working. In the early 10s and stuff like that, you get child labor laws, which are first struck down by the Supreme Court, but eventually there's restrictions on child labor and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so those are some of the big effects of industrialization and urbanization, one of the most important themes throughout US history. What about deurbanization? This is something that starts to happen in the 1950s, right after World War II. Can anyone take a guess why it starts to happen then? Why do people start leaving big cities and moving to the suburbs? And who is leaving?
Is it the risk of nuclear bombs?
I'm sure there were some people who were scared about that in the 50s and 60s, but that's not a major thing. And those people probably went and lived in some caves rather than in suburbs. But think about it this way. One, cities are cramped. They're kind of uncomfortable. They're cramped. They're tight. They have so much smog. They're smelly. They have a lot of crime and gangs and all these problems. They have often corrupt government, everything. Tammany Hall, all these institutions, these political machines, everything. And they're not very nice place to live, especially not with a family. So you start to see people, and also you have to remember that theme of immigrants. People don't like immigrants, and there's so many immigrants in the city. So if you don't like immigrants, why do you want to live with the immigrants? So you get a ton of white people doing what's called white flight, where they basically just middle class or upper middle class white people start to move out of cities to the suburbs, where they can get bigger houses. They can live that more idyllic lifestyle, very 50s-esque, where you have you buy your own house, you got a nice little lawn, you got a 2-car garage. Cars make it so much easier. Now that cars are getting cheaper and easier, more accessible, you can just drive to work. You don't need to live in the city anymore. People are working more in service jobs now, especially white people. So service jobs, just to go 9 to 5. Take your dad takes the car out. Mom might have some other job, or often will stay where take care of the kids. Perfectly cut grass in your lawn. Simple but nice house in a nice neighborhood. That sort of thing. The idyllic suburban lifestyle starts to become the dream for a lot of people. People want to build that up. Okay, so does that make sense as the first major step of a deurbanization and suburbanization?
So who's the one?
You should think of what things look like today. If you actually look around America today, you can see a lot of this. Who here lives in a suburb? Oh, I don't know if we're really a suburb, but we're basically a suburb, my town. So that's suburbia wasn't that populated until the 1950s and onwards. So that's the real start of that sort of change. Major shift in America. Okay, so what else should we talk about in our last little bits of time? So big themes we've talked about: industrialization, urbanization. That's super important. We've talked about immigration a bit, speculation, revolution, north-south divide. Okay, so how about we talk a little bit about, is there any specific topic you guys have? Nothing? Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the founding documents. These are usually don't come up in full force, but there'll be at least some MCQs at least about founding documents. So make sure you you don't need to read through them again, but go online, read a cheat sheet summary, go to crash course, whatever. Make sure you know these pretty well. So the important stuff, obviously, I just briefly went through the Constitution. You should know some of the basic powers of the Constitution. Article 1, legislature. Article 2, executive. 3, judiciary. And then the other ones they're not as important. Bill of Rights. Know the important parts of the Bill of Rights. First Amendment, free speech, freedom of religion, stuff like that. And of course, the Federalist Papers. These will easily come up. Make sure you know at least the 4 major ones in the curriculum. Actually know what they're talking about, because the AP test writers will be nice to you. They'll almost always give you a snippet of text from the Federalist Paper or from the Constitution or something. but you have to like, as you probably have realized, that text is difficult to read, especially on a timed exam, and to figure out what it's saying. So it's so much easier if you've already like read a summary of what these major stuff mean. So that way you don't have to try to read all this old, fancy, unnecessarily like garish English. So it'll really help you out. So make sure to read about those kind of stuff then. So important ones, most important one, it'll be like Federalist number 10, which is James Madison's treatise on how factions emerge. Like when I was in APUSH, and I think when a lot of kids are in APUSH, you have no clue why this is important. Like, who cares if factions emerge? Reason it's important is the idea that in any system, especially a system like a democracy like ours was supposed to be, or ours is, you're going to have these factions emerge, these different groups of people who have different interests and want different things. And you have to figure out how to deal with that reasonably. It's a pretty simple and kind of obvious idea, but it is an important thing to, it was a really important part of considering the foundation of the country. It was a big reason they were arguing that we needed this federal government, this strong federal government, and this federal constitution, because the Federalist Papers fundamentally are a public argument in favor of the Constitution. They're trying to convince people the Constitution is a good thing. So they're saying like, well, we have all these people who want different things, states that want different things, farmers want different things from merchants. You need a strong federal government to resolve those disputes. That's the idea of Federalist number 10 at a most fundamental level. You also, I forget the other numbers, you can go reference them, but you have important ideas about the balance of power, the balance of the three parts of government, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, balancing each other out, making sure not one branch gets too powerful. So make sure you understand those documents. I can almost guarantee you, like at least it's very common, they'll either have an excerpt from the Constitution or from the Bill of Rights or from the Federalist Papers, or they'll have something from like an early founding father, like some speech they made or something they wrote. So make sure you understand a lot in that context. Okay, that's an important part. Remember, like, it's treat each stage with humility. Don't just treat each stage of American history either at one as today. They are not today. Like, those people were very different from people today. So don't treat them like they are people of today who are literate and not farmers usually, and didn't have iPhones and didn't have toilets even, and all that sort of stuff. And were much more religious. And two, don't default to America is faultless. I mean, I love America. I'm a great believer in America, but obviously it is not faultless. They've made mistakes. We've made mistakes today. They made mistakes in the past. So approach each question you read with make sure you have both the attitude of, I am going to approach this with humility and treat people as they were then. I'm going to try to understand them in the context of their time period. And I'm not going to assume that they are faultless, because, I mean, regardless of what you think, I mean, I think everyone thinks that like slavery and a lot of those things are obviously terrible things, but regardless of what you think, you need to be able to understand how people were thinking then, because when you do the multiple choice questions and stuff like that, you're going to get these little excerpts, primary source experts. And I think it's so easy for us to just read them like they're people today writing them. Think about what they would have been meaning at the time. Hello, cat. What's the cat's name?
Chewy.
Chewy? Oh,
Yeah.
Chewy, he's home. But anyway, that sort of stuff, like, as in like if John Adams is writing something about the new country that's emerging, then get yourself in the mind frame of, oh my God, we're dealing with like yeoman farmers, we're dealing with people who are illiterate, we're dealing with a merchant class, and then north-south divide, and we have slavery and a much smaller federal government. Get yourself in the mindset of the year that something is written in. That's like when you read the year, when you read like 1803, think about what what America looked like then. And then and think about what the statement, the words mean in that context. That'll really help you. Like, obviously, I don't think you're going to think there's skyscrapers or smartphones or whatever. But it's really easy to just like default to imagining the country as a bunch of literate people who've gone to school, or defaulting to imagining urbanization as the most common situation, even though most people didn't live in cities at the time, or imagining that people don't really care that much about religion like they do today. They cared a lot about religion then, about Christianity and Protestantism. So make sure you get in that mindset, and then don't be afraid to think critically about what people are saying, especially in the FRQs. Like, here's what I agreed with what they said. Here's like maybe where they were wrong, or maybe in the DBQ say like this person pointed out why this person was actually wrong with this idea. Make sure to have your own ideas, your own convictions. Don't just go for the low-hanging fruit. Think higher level on the FRQ side. Okay. Any questions? I know we didn't cover everything, but I thought we got a decent amount of stuff done. Any questions at all? Any questions about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness? No? Okay, last thing I'll say is don't stress out about it. That'll make life harder. Like, I remember I got super stressed when I took my first AP test in like 9th grade, but then once 10th grade, I just like was like hang loose, took it easy, and it was way better. Like, obviously you have to study, you probably have to do some cramming, but don't stress out about it. Like, there's like beyond what you study, there's not much you can control, so there's no reason obsessing over it. Whatever you can do in the time frame, you just work as hard as you can in 3 hours and 30 minutes. When it's done, it's done. And like make sure to relax before the test. Like, obviously study, but I'd suggest take a short break before you, like the night before, make sure you don't get too intense about it. Otherwise you will be tired and sad and life will be bad. Okay? Cool beans. Well, bye if you guys don't have any questions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.